Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the virtual IPK. I'm glad you're here. You know, whatever here means right now, it's this screen, and it's the right place to be. Um, we are really thrilled to be doing this event tonight. One of the great pleasures of the Institute for Public Knowledge is that we do a lot of book events and we do a lot of book launches, especially for people who are active in our intellectual community. And there's this kind of ritual thing that sometimes happens in the academic world, which is that our colleague writes a book and spends years on it, and we celebrate the book publication by giving them a really hard time in public and asking them really difficult questions and forcing them to feel the heat. Um, and we here at IPK try to do things a little bit differently. So we promise robust debate and deep intellectual discussion tonight, but we also genuinely want to have a celebration because let's face it, we could all use a little celebrating right now. And this is the right occasion. So now that I see even more people loaded in, let me first introduce myself. My name is Eric Kleinenberg. I'm a professor of sociology and also the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. The IPK is a provostial institute. We're university-wide. We do a lot of original research projects and have a lot of faculty, graduate student working groups, and also do a lot of events and convenings. In an ideal world, we do them face-to-face. But we're not exactly living in an ideal world at the moment. We might be getting closer to a better one. But for the moment, we're here virtually. And it's a thrill to be here tonight to celebrate the almost publication. It was supposed to be publication date, but it's been delayed for a week. The almost publication day of Up to Heaven and Down to Hell, Fracking, Freedom, and Community in an American Town. This is a new book by my colleague in sociology and also the chair of environmental studies, Colin Jeromak, who up until this point has been known informally as the pigeon guy, and now is going to require an entirely new identity. And maybe we can come up with one tonight. I feel like the fracking guy, the shale guy just doesn't cut it. So maybe we can do better. Colin is going to get things started by talking for about 20 minutes about the book. He worked on the book for 8 years, so we told him he could get about 2.5 minutes for every year of the book. We want him to give us a kind of overview of what he's found and introduce us to some of the characters and also the ethnographic writing that's part of this project and that makes it so special. We then are really lucky. We have two of the great environmental sociologists around here to comment. First, Rebecca Elliott from the London School of Economics. I got to participate in the launch for her new book, Underwater, about flood insurance, the politics of flood insurance and climate change, just a few weeks ago. And she's really just one of the most interesting creative thinkers on environmental issues around, period. So she'll speak, and then we'll hear from Harvey Malich, who I'd call the dean of environmental sociology, except for I know Harvey really well, and the last thing in the world he'd want to be is a dean. You know, these are really great minds, and Colin will be able to respond, and then I'm going to invite all of you to ask questions. You can use the Q&A function on the Zoom screen, which I know you know so well at this point, to ask questions at any point, and we'll funnel them over to Colin. Before you get started, Colin, I just want to say personally how delighted I am to have you here, how thrilled I am for you to publish this book. You know, ethnography is extraordinarily difficult work, and this is a hard ethnography to have done. It was far from home. It was in a place that is undergoing a lot of trauma of different kinds. There's an insight in the book about the way in which, you know, the fracking as a social process and a technological intervention, it also generates a kind of fragmentation at the community level, at the social level, divides people in new and different ways, creates wealth for some and creates genuine suffering and disease for others. And Colin, in this truly original work, is engaged with fundamental questions about public life and private life, about kind of individual freedom and collective responsibilities. In a way, the issues that we've been grappling with through the pandemic come up in this book about fracking. It's not just a book about fracking; it's a book about so much more. And Colin, before you get started, I want to say how happy I am and your colleagues are at NYU that the book is out in the world in a matter of days, and we're really eager to learn from you. So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Eric. I just start with thank you to everybody at IPK and Eric. My last book was also launched at the IPK, and so it's really special to have this one be launched here as well. And to the panelists, Rebecca has her own wonderful book just out. Congratulations for that. And Harvey, Harvey was a panelist on that first book launch. And so I'm glad he came out of retirement for one last job. I just hope it doesn't go as poorly as it does in the movies when that happens.
We believe in recycling at the IPK, Colin, so we're doing our best.
So I'm going to start with a tiny bit of background about how I came to this book, and then give you a little tiny bit about the big ideas, and then do a character sketch of just two different people who are main characters of the book, because the book is very narrative and character driven. So quite some time ago now, when I first arrived at NYU, there was soon after I arrived, I also teach in the environmental studies department, and the documentary Gasland came out. A lot of you are familiar with this documentary, which basically set the terms of the controversy in a lot of ways surrounding fracking. Faucets on fire because of the methane in them, and there really started to be a lot of activism, particularly in New York, around trying to turn what was then a moratorium into a ban on fracking. And a lot of my students in my environmental studies courses, this became their obsession. And so my courses basically got taken over by fracking. And at the same time, Pennsylvania, which is the state that I'm originally from, I started to hear murmurings of all this natural gas buried underneath. And I was really struck when I read a report that called Pennsylvania the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. And so there was a lot going on here, and I really, as a community ethnographer, I really just wanted to get into a place and see how this was playing out on the ground. Super quickly, for the few people that might be uninitiated, fracking, so there are layers of shale rock located throughout America, largely coincidentally in the heartland in the middle of America. And buried in a lot of this shale, stuck frozen in there, are these molecules of gas and oil. We've known that it's there for a long time. We didn't know how to get it. And so what we colloquially call fracking is the combination of two processes that only really came together this century and enabled us to start this process of extracting this oil and gas. So you drill down to the shale layer, and what's novel is horizontal drilling. So they could have a remote control drill bit that when it hits that shale layer, it then curves and drills horizontally through the shale layer, and they can now drill horizontally for about 2 miles. And so you drill horizontally through the shale layer, and then the fracking part, hydraulic fracturing, is you put down. So first you drop down depth charges, which explode, and what that does is it shoots ball bearings basically through the rock and creates all these fissures in the rock so that the oil and gas can come out. And then the hydraulic fracturing part is at incredibly high pressure, you pump millions of gallons of water and sand and some chemicals which act as lubricants and anti-corrosive agents down into that wellbore, and the water finds its way into the cracks and breaks them open more, and then the sand holds those cracks open just enough that oil and gas can come back out. So fracking really didn't take off as a thing until 2007, 8, 9. And that's when it really started happening in Pennsylvania by 2010 and 2011 was when the so-called fracking boom began. So I decided to move to a place, Williamsport, Pennsylvania, located in Lycoming County, north central Pennsylvania. And some of you might know it as the home of Little League Baseball. And I chose that place because the year before I moved there, it was the most heavily drilled county in Pennsylvania. So drilling came later to Williamsport than it did to some other places. And so it was a place where I knew there would be a lot of drilling going on and land leasing going on. And my sort of broad question was really just to get a handle on how fracking was impacting rural community life, places which had seen so-called brain drain, depopulation, loss of jobs, now seeing this new industry coming in. And, I don't think I need to tell you that fracking is one of today's most consequential and contentious land uses. Energy analysts often note that the frenetic pace and the vast scale of the fracking boom has transformed geopolitics and the world economy. If you think about the United States, we've gone from anxieties around peak oil to now a glut of oil and natural gas. We can export natural gas to Europe so that they can loosen their dependence on Gazprom from Russia. And so there's all these kinds of broad ways that it gets talked about. Of course, also talked about in broad ways as far as climate change that results from continuing or doubling down on fossil fuels. But where my book intervenes is that this big picture overlooks how personal fracking is. The energy revolution is in large part actually a series of individual choices that private landowners make rather than the result of collective deliberation. Where we stand as a nation as far as fracking or not fracking, how fast we do it, how slow we do it, is mostly not a result of which side wins out in these national level political debates. It's every individual, unless those rights have been severed, most landowners own the property, the mineral rights underneath their property. And this is unique to the United States. There's a clause in which is where the title of my book comes from, in common law: whoever owns the soil, it is theirs up to heaven and down to hell. So fracking really is a decision that thousands of individual landowners make who live over the shale. And if they lease their property, they get a bonus. And if oil or gas are taken out from their property, they get royalties. And so when I moved to this area, the way that at least the story I expected to find, the way that a lot of the media would focus on these communities where fracking has kind of torn them in half. So there was people that were opposed to it, people that were all for it, and how this tore communities apart. That's not the politics I found. I found that almost every landowner leased and almost everybody supported it. And indeed, I now know that shale communities are more like Williamsport than those early media portrayals. We know from research, particularly by sociologist Fedor Dokshin, that the closer people live to shale gas and oil wells, the more likely they are to support it. So most places that are located right in the areas where the most drilling is happening overwhelmingly support drilling. So the strength of property rights in America basically construe fracking as a private decision. A landowner meets with a representative of an oil and gas company at the kitchen table and decides whether or not to sign a lease. But this ostensibly private decision, of course, has public consequences. We often talk about them on the planetary scale. Methane itself, which is the gas that they are extracting from the ground in Pennsylvania, is a potent greenhouse gas. And burning it still produces carbon, even if it produces less carbon than coal. But of course, there's also a lot of public consequences that are felt at the community level. Fracking impacts neighbors' air, sometimes their ability to drink their own water. In many rural areas, in almost all rural areas, people rely on private drinking water. You poke a hole into the ground and drink the water that's there. It also impacts neighbors' ability to enjoy their own property, and it leads to sometimes the loss of what people call the rural character of an area. And so this sort of core tension that is in my book is that almost all residents felt that people should be able to do what they want on their own property. And so on this principle, private leasing, land leasing, is nobody else's business. But they also believe that others were equally entitled to that same right and in being a responsible community member. And on those grounds, neighbors' interests would seem to warrant consideration, since your decision to lease your land or not impacts your neighbors. And as Eric alluded to, I talk about this, I situate this within a recurring political dilemma that I argue is in many ways at the core of political conflicts in America, which is how to balance individual freedom and the Commonwealth. You need only think of COVID, as Eric mentioned, whether individuals have the liberty to congregate unmasked in indoor settings or to bar hop in the midst of a pandemic, even though doing so can expose other people to risk. Of course, gun rights, should an individual have the right to own an assault rifle when that threatens public health. And so this book, largely through the stories of people that confront this conflict, revolves around this tension as it plays out vis-a-vis fracking. So land sovereignty on the one hand, representing individual freedom to do what I want, and the public good on the other side, represented by scarce resources like clean air and clean water that are impacted by this decision. And the concept that I developed throughout the book is something I call the public-private paradox. And so basically property rights, I say, are often treated as if they are akin to free speech, meaning they're a personal decision, right? I'm free to love who I want to love and worship how I want to worship. And that's considered a private choice because me doing that doesn't impact your ability to exercise a private choice, to love somebody else, to worship in a different way. And so the private decisions like this are protected and are basically not regulated because they are not seen as being a part of the public domain. And so property rights when it comes to fracking are treated similarly. And I argue that, they ought not be because they have these spillover effects. And I make the broader argument that a lot of decisions that we don't think of as public environmental decisions, eating meat, which is very carbon intensive, driving SUV or choosing to drive a car at all versus public transport, these decisions in the aggregate are what creates global warming or what creates climate refugees and droughts and hurricanes. And so these seemingly private decisions in the aggregate impact the public sphere. And so I call this a public-private paradox. These seemingly private decisions are actually public decisions, but they're not regulated like decisions that impact the public sphere. And more specifically, when we assert our right to consume a disproportionate share of the world's energy, as Americans do, and emit a disproportionate share of the world's greenhouse gases, what I'd say in the book is we seldom acknowledge how exercising this right actually alienates other people from that same right to liberty and to property. And so that's sort of this idea that I try to develop that doesn't just apply to fracking, but applies to a lot of private decisions. And in America, we've prioritized individual liberty to eat what we want to eat, consume what we want, waste how we want, and don't really think about the ways that that literally infringes on other people's civil liberties. And so with the remaining time that I have, I want to just provide a couple character sketches of some of the main people that you'll meet if you read the book, and they illustrate some of the broader stories that I'm talking about. So let me see if I can successfully pull off a screen share here. Good. Okay, so this is George Hagemeyer, and George lives on 77 acres of land that he inherited from his parents. He never got to know his father. His father died when he was 2 years old. And so George often talks about how owning this property is the way that he has a connection to his father. And he lovingly calls it his daddy's land. George lived off of a modest retirement pension that he received from being he was a custodian who retired. And basically George is a winner in the fracking lottery. When he leased his 77 acres, he got a bonus for that. He separately allowed a 6-inch pipeline to be laid along the corner of his property, made $60,000 off of that. They drilled 6 natural gas wells in his backyard, and he received royalties off of that. The first royalty check that he got, which is just for the first month of production, was $34,000. So George was on his way to becoming what locals call a shalionaire. And so George embodied the individualist ethos that so many landowners I met in this area. I should say this county went over 70% for Trump in both elections. And I would argue that a lot of people are not just conservative, but libertarian in their political leanings. And George was one of them. He firmly believed he had the God-given right to total autonomy over how he used his land, and even a duty to realize his productive potential. He would say, my daddy made this land valuable and useful by farming it. I make this land valuable and useful by drilling on it. I asked him one time whether the Department of Environmental Protection, municipal authorities, or the community should have a say in his decision to lease his land because fracking impacted the Commonwealth. And George replied with a simple and decisive, nope. When I asked him to justify his answer, say a little bit more, he curtly added, it's my land and I'll do as I damn well please. In turn, George believed that it was none of his or the government's business what other people did on their property. Live and let live was the ethos George lived by. He bristled at any form of government intrusion onto his land, to the point that when the gas company was required by state law to put up several safety signs at the entrance of his driveway because there was heavy trucks moving in and out, he viewed this as an infringement on his land property and his sovereignty and was really pissed off about it. So midway through writing this book, I invited George to come to my class, and the idea was I invited somebody who started an anti-fracking group and George, with the idea that George would represent the viewpoint of people that supported fracking, and the other person, the activist, would represent the view of people who were opposed to fracking. George, with his newfound money, rented a stretch limousine to come from central Appalachian, Pennsylvania to my class. He said that it was the first and the last time he was coming to New York City, but when he stood before my class, say that he regretted leasing and to renounce fracking. And I was really struck by this, surprised by this. And I was even more surprised when I found out that George did not suffer any major calamities. His water was not contaminated. There was nothing spilled in, that would destroy his grass or his soil. His turning on fracking was the result of a series of what seemed like from afar minor indignities. The guard shack that remained stationed at the front of his driveway to protect the infrastructure that was there. He only learned about the fact that the company is going to withdraw thousands of gallons of water from the creek that flowed through his property when he read a classified ad in the newspaper announcing it. Same with a radio tower that they put on his property. And then one time he got a call that a video camera that he did not even know was on his property had recorded him walking across the well pad. And he was told that if he did it again, even though the well pad was in his backyard, he could be arrested for trespassing. And here I'll just show you what that well pad infrastructure looks like on his. Let me do this share screen. Yeah. Okay. That's what the well pad looked like there in his backyard. And so he was told that he would be arrested if he did that. And so what George didn't understand when he signed his lease was how much of his land sovereignty he had signed away. The thing that was perhaps the most valuable to him of anything. George had unwittingly become, I say, a tenant on his own property. So now I'm going to introduce you to one other couple, and then I'll wrap up from there. This is Tom and Mary Crawley. Tom and Mary Crawley. Pardon, I just want to make sure. Am I sharing the screen? Sorry about that. I just, for some reason, am not seeing the sign like I used to. So Tom and Mary live on 9 acres of land that originally was part of a 440-acre farm that Tom's great-grandfather owned. And when fracking came to town, they, like many people, were supportive of leasing. They never stood to make much money. They leased their 9 acres, made $7,000. Their property was so small that any royalties generated per month would not be life-changing amounts of money. But nonetheless, they were supportive of it. The one thing that they did to increase their leverage in leasing was they banded together with dozens of other landowners that lived around them, so that together they were a collective bargaining unit. Basically, they call it a land coalition, which could then shop themselves around to different petroleum companies and say, if you want to lease one of us, you have to lease all of us, and sort of have greater protections and hopefully earn a better signing bonus by operating as a group. A gas well was drilled on their next door neighbor's property, and after that happened, their well water was laced with methane, so much so that explosive levels of methane. You could light it on fire. And what you actually see in this picture, this quaint picture of them, that plastic tube behind them is a vent that was placed over their private water well. The hope was that it would vent as much of the methane as possible so that it would no longer be explosive when it went into their household. Despite this vent, despite water filtration systems, they still faced high levels of methane in their water. They refused to drink it. 8 years running, they still have methane in their water. The creek near their property still bubbles over with methane. And so that's where things stand with them. And so I expected the Crawleys, given what happened to them, to turn against fracking and even to become what sometimes are called accidental activists. They were really pissed. They felt that the Department of Environmental Protection wasn't doing much to hold these gas companies accountable. They felt that their local representative, state representative, who was very sympathetic to the industry, wasn't really doing anything. And I went to a public town hall where they excoriated their state representative for not doing anything. And so I really kind of expected them to turn against the industry. But what was really interesting is over time, and to this day, my book will actually be the first time their story has been told. They refused to go public with what happened to them. And I thought that doing so would help pressure the petroleum company to remedy the situation. The petroleum company was denying responsibility, wasn't doing anything. And they also refused to speak to the Responsible Drilling Alliance, which was a small local anti-drilling advocacy group, even though the Responsible Drilling Alliance was offering them a pro bono lawyer, and they were worried that they didn't have the money to afford a lawyer to fight the company, the gas company. And so I thought they had nothing to lose. Why wouldn't they team up with the RDA? Why wouldn't they go public against the industry? And what I learned was that the Crawleys' decision to stay quiet wasn't about what was in it for them. It was about defending their community. Specifically, they worried that environmentalists from, quote, outside the community who heard about the case would demonize their nice old neighbor, as they put it, whose property hosted the gas well, or otherwise disrupt the community. Pardon me, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second if I could do that. It disappeared. I don't know. This is the problem with these things. Something always has to go wrong, right? Um, where are you? Okay, there we go. Um, Sorry for that disruption there. The fourth wall break. Um, Mary expressed she was really worried about a picket line, and Tom said we're really afraid that everybody's going to blame our neighbors, and it's not their fault. These people, meaning environmentalists, don't have any interest in this area other than creating a stink. And I came to realize that this idea, this notion of picketers from New York or Philadelphia actually coming in and protesting wasn't as outlandish as it sounded to me at first. I'll just point to two incidents that were recent at the time. A nearby trailer home community was going to be evicted to make way for a facility that would withdraw water for the fracking industry. And when activists found out about it, they took buses in from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and New York and literally camped out at the place so that the people there couldn't be evicted, and they called it Occupy Riverdale. Another group of people, Artists Against Fracking, famously started by Yoko Ono, Sean Lennon, and Susan Sarandon, had taken a bus through with a bunch of journalists through central Pennsylvania, getting out and protesting at fracking installations. And so this really created this sense that these urban liberals were going to come in and disrupt things here, and that they were afraid of that happening and their neighbors being the ones that would suffer from this. And I should say that, we now have more research beyond my single case study that demonstrates that anti-fracking activism is not entirely, but for a lot of the part, not in my backyard activism. It's actually largely not in your backyard movement that is spearheaded by progressives living in urban and coastal areas, coming into these communities in the heartland where most drilling is occurring and where most people are conservative and support drilling. And so in this light, fracking was viewed as a way of showing supporting fracking was viewed as a way for the Crawleys to show solidarity with their community against outsiders, even if it actually wasn't beneficial for them. So my final thoughts, I'll say that, in a lot of ways, land leasing is a pretty typical resource dilemma. The Crawleys only had 9 acres. A lot of people around them had hundreds of acres. They saw that everybody around them was leasing. And so they also thought it didn't really make sense for them not to lease, even though they supported drilling anyway, but it didn't really make sense for them not to lease because they still would have suffered the consequences of it. But I think it's facile to frame this resource dilemma associated with leasing as unavoidable, or to paint lessors as the bad guys. And I'll say it's the result of a unique legal and political structure in America that does 3 things. One, it constitutionally enshrines and grants preeminence to private subsurface mineral ownership. And what this does is, yes, individual property owners can make money from it, but it also puts the onus of underground mining decisions on these individuals, on individual property owners. It doesn't put the onus on a collective decision made either through a referendum or by politicians acting in the public interest. This legal and political structure also does not account for most of the externalities that neighbors and the planet must absorb from the oil and gas industry on leased land. And finally, this legal and political structure, for the most part, in most places where fracking occurs, strips communities of the traditional autonomy that they have to ensure that private property rights don't jeopardize the Commonwealth. So what I'm talking about here is every major oil and gas producing state, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Texas, a lot of municipalities have been able to traditionally, the way that they have been able to control and regulate industry and land use is through zoning. They would say we designate this area a rural zone or an agricultural zone or a residential zone. And so in these areas, we don't allow certain industries. Well, what almost all of these major oil and gas producing states did was they created preemptions or rules where municipalities could not keep fracking out or regulate it through zoning. So Pennsylvania created uniform standards set by the state. And the argument was, as long as those standards were met, so for instance, at the time that they set them, that a gas well was not closer than 1,000 feet from the closest drinking water source, then municipalities had to allow fracking in every zone, even in zones designated as rural or residential, where it would be very hard to put any kind of other industrial use. And what I talk about in the conclusion of the book is, what's really interesting is in a lot of states, you see municipalities suing and trying to enact their own local, control over fracking. And even in really conservative municipalities where this is happening, they are trying to enact rules that are more restrictive than the rules set by the state. So even in conservative areas, you do see that there's people that would like greater regulations of this industry, and they're actually being sued by their own states or by their own state regulatory bodies when they try to enact local control in this way. And I also talk about the ways that environmentalists, not all of them, but a lot of environmentalists miss the mark Because like a lot of observers, I did find a deep and abiding love for the land among a lot of the conservative landowners like George that I befriended. And this rejection of environmentalism, I argue, was not a wholesale disavowal of land conservation. It was a circling of the wagons in defense of property rights against the perceived onslaught of urban interests. I think there's room to get rural residents on board with some environmentalist goals, but only if activists make room for policies that harmonize with so-called rural values like land sovereignty and local control. And I would just say this is not quite as accommodationist as it might sound, like we're just giving in to conservatives. None other than Eleanor Ostrom, who was the famous nemesis of Garrett Hardin, won a Nobel Prize for demonstrating how when communities are given the autonomy and the collective decision-making power to control local resources, that a lot of them will conserve local resources. So the last thing I'll do to just totally wrap this up here is I'll read the final paragraph of my book, which I think gives a nice sort of broad summation. I've come to the conclusion that America's legal and political privileging of individual sovereignty and property rights sanctions the usurping of the commons, frays the fabric of communities, and undermines the social contract. I do entertain some glimmer of optimism that if more of us recognize that externalities produced by personal land and energy use choices violate others' human rights, more people might push for green energy policies that rein in those externalities in the name of other core American principles, namely fairness and democracy. After all, the idea that everyone deserves the same freedoms and that every community stakeholder should have a say in the decisions that affect them is as American as Little League Baseball. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. I want to remind everyone that you should have received or will soon be receiving an email from Princeton University Press that gives you a discount of some kind for buying Colin's book. Is that right, Colin? So it's a tradition at IPK that we have a bookseller at our book launches, and we, exert a little moral pressure on everyone at the end of the session not to let the bookseller go home with a box of books. I can't repeat that here, but it'll be our collective project to launch Colin's book into the top of the Princeton University Press bestseller list for the day. Rebecca, why don't you jump in?
Great. Thanks very much to IPK for the invitation to discuss this really powerful book. And thank you to Colin for the book. I mean, the first thing that has to be said about it, of course, is that as a piece of writing and sociological storytelling, it is a huge gift. I mean, in that respect, it's completely of a piece with everything that Colin has written. When I was working on my book, I wrote a garbage version of my introduction that I sent to my editor, and with great good nature and sensitivity, he wrote back and suggested that I reread the best book introduction on my bookshelf and think about what made it so good and how I might make my introduction better. And I reached for the Global Pigeon, Colin's first book. So now we all have Up to Heaven and Down to Hell to turn to for inspiration and to get us unstuck as writers. And, Colin's writing is so powerful, and you'll remember the names and the stories of the people that you meet in this book because Colin is able to fully realize them on the page. They're complicated, they live with contradictions, as we all do. They're not held up to score an easy point in an argument. They're not cast as heroes or villains. And you trust Colin as a narrator because he holds his own ideas up to their scrutiny often throughout the book. And he invites you into the moments of surprise when conventional narratives break down and simple explanations don't satisfy. So, the book is a troubling read in many respects, but it was absolutely no trouble to read. And in my view, I think this makes Colin one of the standard setters for writing in sociology. But of course, clear and compelling writing is the companion of clear and compelling thinking. And the ideas here clarify the stakes of conflicts that we perhaps misrecognize. They force us to sit with discomforting ambivalences. And ultimately, I think give a really persuasive diagnosis of some of the pathologies of American life, reflected in the privileging of individual sovereignty and property rights, and what that does to our commons, our civic life, and our social contract. And so, that's what makes this book not just an important book about fracking, but an important book, full stop. So I have a couple of kind of sets of questions, and Colin is obviously kind of free to choose which ones he wants to take up. But the first question is about loss and landscape. So, as Colin described, a lot of what we, a kind of chattering public, talk about and think about when it comes to fracking has to do with the pollution, the contaminated drinking water, the methane leaks, the industrial waste. But what this book really vividly evokes, I mean, for me, really for the first time, is the particular industrialization of the rural landscape. The wellheads, the rigs, the paved roads, the pipelines, the drowning out of birdsong, or just the loss of take it for granted silence, the vistas and views that end up blocked by a private security guard monitoring a public road. The chapter on what's happening to some of the public forests in Pennsylvania, I think, is especially evocative and was for me in some ways the most difficult chapter of the book to read. There are photos in the book that are fabulous, but you almost don't need them because the writing is so good in this respect. And what I think all that invites the reader to be reflexive about is not only these kind of environmental effects that we perhaps know more about, but also aesthetic attachments, the ones held by the people in the book, but also our own. Because, if we think about the energy transformation that we want, that's an energy transformation that also has aesthetic implications, where decisions made privately will have broader consequences. Wind turbines and solar panels also industrialize the view. They're hardware, they take a lot of space. Now, you didn't write a book about wind and solar farms, so I'm not asking you to speculate, kind of beyond your own data, but I'd be really keen if you have any thoughts about the kind of up to heaven part of the title. Are there lessons that we can take from studying fracking about what is disrupted, what is lost, that we might use to understand what's at stake in some of the land use issues that are probably unavoidable, probably already unfolding in a renewable energy transition? And perhaps, what's going to be different? For instance, we probably don't want to have to convince ourselves of the beauty of a wellhead, but together we might want to get to a place where we regard a wind turbine as a beautiful part of the landscape. And then the second set of questions is about climate change and property. So, a lot of people are going to read this book because they care about climate change. And one of the conclusions here is that, of course, climate change is a structural issue. It's not an individual one about bad consumers or villainous land lessers. But more specifically, as your concluding comments pointed us to, a big part of this is about this unique legal and political structure around private property. And so, you talked about this kind of recommendation about kind of following Ralph's lead, understanding and engaging pragmatically with property owners on issues they care about. But I'd be curious to hear, any other kind of reflections you have about addressing that legal and political structure that they and we are in. I mean, to put it a little bit differently, I guess, I'd just be interested in hearing about, like, is part of this just about the pathology of private property? What are the kinds of problems that private property as an institution that we are materially and emotionally and morally invested in, what are the problems that it poses, when it comes to climate change? And then the last question is methodological. I mean, you're not only an ethnographer, a user of the methods, you're someone who's thought really critically about the methods and written about the methods. And I think it would just be interesting to hear more about the kind of ethnographic experience. Specifically, are there principles of your kind of praxis that you've developed that were particularly important, for revealing what you were able to reveal? Or were there kind of particular moments of the research that illuminated the distinct importance of ethnographic methods for studying environmental issues like fracking? So in closing, I'll just say again, what a fabulous book this is. Everyone should buy it. It's supremely instructive, it's heart-wrenching, it's provocative, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Rebecca. Colin, I'm sure there's a lot you want to say, but I'm going to let Harvey go first. And then Colin, we'll give you some time to respond to Rebecca and Harvey together before we open it up. Harvey?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Eric. And of course, it's a great pleasure to be back at IPK. That was after not only my own retirement, but everyone's retirement. And so we're all equal again. Colin's book was a great relief to me because I wanted to like it because of our own relationship over the years and my participation in his projects. And I was greatly relieved that I actually love it. And so thank you, Colin, for that private satisfaction that you gave me. From Colin's introductory remarks, as well as Rebecca's wonderful remarks, you already see that this book has plenty of nitty gritty. It is more nitty gritty, literally, than I think any commentary I've ever heard at IPK, or maybe at any academic enterprise in sociology. We heard about the sand and the bits and the pieces, and that tells you what grounded work really looks like and what it sounds like. And it's especially remarkable that his work has this quality in that it also goes to completely the other end of the spectrum, because in this book, Colin, we meet John Locke, we meet Rousseau, and this is seamlessly done. This is not a kind of, and now my theory, and now my methods, and now the history of Western civilization. It is just seamless as he gets between the rocks and the hard places and the human beings, some of whom you've met. I think it is like no book I have ever read. I think in virtually any field. So I think it's in that way a landmark in our fields as well. Yes, we learn about local solidarities and how they work. We learn about self-interest and how it works. And this is oriented toward the great dilemma of collective action and living in the tragedy of the commons, which is something that we are all beset with, like it or not. So it is ethnography meets Garrett Hardin. And the fact, by the way, that so much attention goes to Garrett Hardin is symptomatic of another aspect of the book, which is that Colin takes up inconvenience. So Garrett Hardin is profoundly important to thinking and did a magnificent job of sketching out the dilemma of so much, as well as being very disreputable on the left, which causes him to be appropriately disparaged. But other people don't take him seriously in the way that this book takes us seriously. The day by day, almost hour by hour struggle with the commons and the tragedy, how that tragedy works in a fine kind of way, how it works. So it works through community, it works through family, it also works with consumption. So these people who got these checks are thrilled by the fact that they can get a new camper or something like that. And that, even if it gets repossessed, that is a going a dynamic of what's going on in this larger political economy and environmental despoliation that we hear about. There's also over adaptation, not only by the people who build their lives around fracking, but also by the, as we know from reading the macro newspapers, the industries themselves. And that's another thing that this work signals, which is that corporate capitalism and industries sometimes don't know what is in their own interests. And with our concepts of hegemony corporate actors, we sometimes don't hold it in our mind that they are ignorant of their own interests as well. And that is part of the dynamic. And so it has sometimes no rationality whatsoever, sometimes. What we also find out, and I think, by the way, Colin, that you don't quite do just or injustice or whatever it is to Garrett Hardin in this regard, which is that some of these irrationalities and losses are absolute loss. They are potentially irreversible losses. And the tragedy of the commons is not just that the individual herders overgraze the commons, but they can also create a desert. They can irreversibly end the commons. And of course, that would just be a point to remember as we look to the relevance of this project for our contemporary catastrophes that loom before us. Permeating all through the work, of course, is our current moments of problem of President Trump and his residue. The best way to intervene in a more progressive way. One of the things we learned from Colin's book is that the word education is not going to work, that these people need to be more educated, or people like them, that they need different norms or values, and a kind of transfusion model, that it somehow has to be got to them. We can see through the very complexity of their lived experience in the environment, in their own economic interests, in their community fealties. We can see through that complexity that it's going to look different. And there is some dealing with that. If Colin has some closing remarks on that, I would certainly be all ears, especially after the publication of the book and the political events that have taken place, whether he has any thoughts. How can we escape the local? This is such a beautiful job of showing the way habit works and the way embeddedness occurs. How can we get out of it? There are some of the deviants that Colin does speak about in the book, but not so much in his talk just now. Real strong environmentalists in this region are deviant in their context. How is it that they are able to survive? How is it they can deal with this collective problem? And I know Eleanor Ostrom has a solution. To me, I think she is more romantic than Colin is in terms of the capacity to go macro out of this micro model. I want to just remark in summary to Colin, back to where, in a way, I started. It gives me great satisfaction to make this remark. That, as Rebecca pointed out, this is just beautifully written, wonderful, page turner, really. And for me to say that about sociology is really an extreme remark. It's a page turner. It's a landmark in environmental sociology that's just very clear. And we really see the way the social and the material link up in actual practice and consequence. So it's a landmark in environmental sociology. I think it's a landmark in political theory, in showing the way in which theory can be grounded and shown to be grounded. I think it's a landmark in that regard. And finally, I think this book is profound in its craftsmanship. And I really appreciate that, Colin.
Well, thank you, Harvey. Like Rebecca, you did that in the perfect IPK genre style, which is to say, kind of brimming with appreciation and respect for the craft of the work. And also with some really, you've both made a lot of really serious observations about what makes the book specifically important and useful, and ask Colin some important questions. And so, Colin, before we turn it over to a larger conversation, I know there are a lot of people who are weighing in with points, so we'll get there soon. I just want to give you a chance to address any of the issues that Harvey and Rebecca have raised.
Sure, and I won't address nearly all of them because I do want to ensure that some people who want to ask me a question get to do so. So I'll try to be super brief. I think this point, I'm going to try to make a connection between Rebecca's point about like the aesthetics and what to think about disruption and loss with Harvey's point about the local versus the macro, and how I think of. I mean, I really appreciate the point that we need a new infrastructure that's going to involve transmission lines as well. I mean, transmission lines are going to have to run this electricity under a lot of people's property. The wind turbines and the solar panels are going to be spaced out in area. You know, solar needs a lot of open space. Usually that's green space. In cities, it can sometimes be rooftops. It can sometimes be individuals' rooftops. But if we're talking about the scale that we need, and I don't really think there's any way around that. And I think it's important not to deny that. You know, as far as I'll just saying this little aside, the industry likes to call the wellheads Christmas trees, and that is their way of trying to make them sound happier aesthetically than they are. What I think about that, and I think I don't mean this to sound too trite, but is that needs to happen, and it's not always going to be beautiful. I think we need to think a lot harder about how that happens so that communities are involved in the decision-making process. I mean, one of the things about fracking was that this preemption stuff really pissed people off about is they supported the industry. They were not against drilling, but they were appalled that they couldn't even propose what they saw as a really reasonable intervention. And this one doesn't get to the big environmental problems, but just like say, you know, can you run plastic pipelines of water, temporary pipelines on the side of the road so that all these trucks are not on the road? You could do it. The industry is not required to do it. It costs them more money to do it. So they usually don't do it, right? That people were appalled that they say, you know, when they were drilling, if the company would have even just put hay bales up, I would have donated hay bales from my field. That would have mitigated the noise, right? So there's this way that what made people not accept or be so angry about certain disruptions that you could argue we will all have to endure to create the infrastructure we need is the extent that they can at least be involved in saying what those concerns are and being a part of the decision making. And I think this leads into Harvey's point. I'm glad you appreciate it. I mean, I'm really ambivalent about this in that I'm not as romantic as Ostrom that local resource management and decision making is going to be enough to solve climate change. There needs to be some big top-down intervention to make sure we leave fossil fuel on the ground, for instance. But getting back to this point, this is where I see them linking. I do think that if you can make folks feel like they had some part in making the rules, they think the game is more legitimate. And so if you find some way to involve them, I don't think it's enough, but what I try to argue towards the end of the book and point to, I can't demonstrate it, but that is, you know, if we have locals involved in decision-making around fracking, is that going to be enough to stop fracking and mitigate global warming to the degree that we need? No. But I think if you get them involved, make them feel that they have a say, as I argue, they're not actually opposed to environmental regulation at all. They're opposed to environmental regulation that seems distant, that happens in a distant capital, that maybe then they can be bought into the larger processes that need to happen because they feel like they are part of the machine of political decision making. And so that's the one way that I'll try to answer what I think is part of both of your questions. And given my cognizance of time, we can turn it over to other people in the audience.
Thanks, that's great. We have a lot of questions. I'm just gonna try to channel some of them to you, Colin. Harvey and Rebecca, you're welcome to weigh in as well. I want to start, there are actually a bunch of questions that come from people who've got some local experience around the place where you did research, and there are a variety of them. Audrey Becker writes that she grew up in Tioga County and knows that entire communities got frustrated with individual land sovereignty because people who chose to lease their land to gas companies wouldn't take the brunt of the environmental issues, but instead, people who are downwind or downstream or downhill would. Mm-hmm. And she's curious about whether this came up in your research.
Yeah, the way that dynamic came up, I mean, in short, I would say the answer is mostly not. I mean, I was continually blown away, at least in the setting that I was, of how much people supported or refused to say bad things about it. Now that said, this is so Williamsport itself is a small city. It's a tiny little area of a blue oasis. So the 30% that didn't go for Trump are almost all in the town of Williamsport. And here is where you find people, many of whom don't own land or own a little suburban strip of land. And so they were much more opposed to drilling. And they didn't necessarily experience their backyard being destroyed, but everywhere as soon as they drove out anywhere around, to interact with the landscape, they were upset about what's happening. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Responsible Drilling Alliance, the one local advocacy group, certainly not all of the members lived in town, but it was based in town, and a number of the members lived in town. And so that's where you kind of see that dynamic. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people that were concerned. I mean, a lot of times what happened was, I think to me, the answer of that gets their politics is what they do about this concern. So yes, there were people. So there were people who were upset when they find out that a drilling rig, you know, that a neighbor situates their well pad, not the neighbor, the gas company, but right at the edge of that property so that it's right next to almost your barn or your house. And we're upset about that. So those types of situations happen, but often I should note they happen to people who usually lease their own property as well. So they were a part of this, but also upset about these dynamics. A lot of times what I sort of getting to their politics is their answer often was still doing something about that company in this particular situation. So suing the company if it winds up actually hurting the foundation of their house, for instance, with the trucks rumbling by. So even when that did happen, it did happen and people were upset about it. The answer for a lot of them wasn't, let's regulate this industry more. It was, let's go after these bad actors and either sue them or make them try to do the right thing.
Thanks, Colin. Our colleague, Mike Hout, also has a kind of local question. He said that as Rebecca was speaking, he was thinking about the Western Pennsylvania landscape that he knows. His in-laws live between Oil City and Petrolia, and there was a hilltop above their acre that got flattened and hauled away by strip miners. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we failed to learn the lessons from the oil and coal industry. Yeah. You're not writing a planning and policy book exactly, but what do we do to make sure that we learn the right lessons from fracking and don't just wind up doing this again? It's kind of similar thread as to
and I should just say that applies to so many of these places. So Williamsport itself is not this region. It was not a mining region, but it was a lumber region. Williamsport was once the lumber capital of the world and allegedly milled the most board feet of lumber until that was all gone. I don't, you know, I admit my strong point is not these really broad policy prescriptions, but what I would say is that I hope and think that I don't think we're going to learn the lesson unless we basically change it through law so that we can't do it. I mean, I'm certainly on board. If I have to take a pragmatic political solution that a lot of people are floating right now, the clean energy standard, right, which basically would say that by a given year, 2035, for instance, we need to be at zero emissions or net zero emissions from our energy systems, that you do that. And then these companies have to figure out what they're going to do now that they can't strip mine, now that they can't, drill for oil or gas, and they can't do it because that's not renewable energy. That's not going to meet the clean energy standard that's set. So I'm not convinced that that we're going to learn. And so that the next time an industry comes, either a municipality or a state, or even the federal government is going to decide that this particular industry is too disruptive. I think it just has to be this clean energy standard.
So Helene Langlamet asks a question to you and to Harvey, and it's about whether Harvey's old idea of the city as a growth machine also applies to rural contexts. You know, is there a new kind of political economy of place for a world where we're trying to harvest energy in different ways? Are they connected? And maybe Harvey, you want to take a stab at this first?
I would love for Harvey to.
Different kinds of phenomena.
No, I thank you. I think it does apply. I think that it almost goes in multiplies, because it's the boomtown situation, and that's this region has a boomtown problem, which is the local elites who can create hotels, which they did, motels and restaurants and all that, and they go into it, and they go into it beyond what makes sense, because it's a finite resource, and they overinvest. So I think it does apply, but with a new level of irrationality, when it actually has almost an intrinsically boomtown quality, which means also a demise.
So you know what, Colin, because we have so many other questions, I'm going to let Harvey field that one. I'm going to ask you a question from Noor Abdul Wahab, who wants to know if you could explain some of the ways that urban activists organized to overcome the mistrust of pro-fracking local communities and change their own perception of fracking's harm.
Shout out to Nora, who's in my class, Environmental Justice and Inequality. Thank you so much. So one of the things I should note is so the Responsible Drilling Alliance itself, they're quite a small group overall, but they are a local group. They are a Williamsport founded local group, and that's important because some of the people in that group, and one of them who's kind of a star of the book, Ralph Kisberg, does this work. And the work he does is he's basically, I say, he's like me. He's an ethnoc. He drives the back roads. When he sees a well pad, he stops and talks to folks there, and he just says, "Hey, what's going on? Are you encountering any problems?" And whatever those problems are, they may not be problems that he personally cares about. Like it may be problems getting their royalty check. He says, "I know a landman. You know what? I'm going to go figure out if I can get you this royalty check." He meets people where they're at. And what he finds is there are a lot of people, as I mentioned, people are angry about a lot of the particulars of fracking, where the driveway is placed. Now they got this driveway, George has a driveway right by his house, a new driveway with big rig trucks driving up and down it. And so he helps them solve those immediate practical issues. And in doing so, some of them, are like, he finds places of agreement between them. Now, more systematically, one of the things I talk about, which is one of the great successes of the Responsible Drilling Alliance, not them alone, but they played a predominant part, was there was so the state, we haven't gotten into this, but the state leased, Pennsylvania leased state forest for drilling. Rebecca mentioned this. And so there was a beloved area, there still is a beloved area called Rock Run, which is an easily accessible, beautiful, clear creek that has natural pools where people go swimming and hike. And it turned out that there was an energy company had bought the mineral rights and was going to drill there. And Responsible Drilling Alliance found out about this. People didn't know what was happening, publicized it, started organizing hikes there, started organizing public hearings where they brought in state representatives from around the state because they said this is like a statewide issue because people come here to recreate. And a lot of people, even though they supported drilling, loved this place, hiked there, fished there. It was often many people's first exposure to the outdoors, like overnighting, because you can also backpack there. And so a lot of everyday conservative people were really pissed about drilling in Rock Run and got involved in that campaign. And it's not officially that they're not going to frack there, but it was imminent. The stakes were out of where the well pads were going to go. And that was now almost 10 years ago. And so they've basically stopped it from happening because of this public pressure campaign. And that was a way that Responsible Drilling Alliance created this thing out of it called like Save Special Places, where they then identified a lot of other much beloved local state parks and parts of them that were targeted for gas drilling. And that was one way that I saw that they were able to get people that otherwise were not willing to actually join an anti-fracking campaign to join that campaign.
Great, thanks, Colin. We have a few more questions. One that just came up from Ian Gray is, I think, timely for this conversation. He wants to know what kind of time horizons your informants entertained. How do they imagine what would happen to their property and the fracking infrastructure once the gas is gone? Environmental degradation goes on for a long time. We see it in a lot of different places, and there's a lot of stranded infrastructure that gets abandoned and the public has to deal with it. Now it's not on public land, it's on private land. Is that a conversation or are people just kind of engaging with the kind of needs of the moment?
No, it is a conversation, but it's actually usually in the opposite way that the question I think implies, which is that a lot of folks saw this as the life vest that was going to allow them to hold on to their property, and importantly for future generations. So George talked about how George is a bachelor. He has one adopted daughter who has children, none of whom have expressed an interest in living on the land itself, which really bothers him. What he wants nothing more than for the future generations to live on this property. So one of the things he's done with some of the money is he's tied it to the land, and you can't inherit the money. His family can't inherit the money unless somebody either lives on the property or promises that it will in perpetuity never be developed. And there was another family that I follow, 10 siblings whose parents owned a farm. Parents died. None of the siblings want the farm, but it's still this focal place. They have barbecues there. They gather there. They want to keep it, but that's a huge property tax bill. It's like 160 acres. Now they think this is what makes us not have to sell this property. And so there were a number of people, third, fourth, fifth generation property owners that their biggest anxiety was that on their watch, they might lose this property, right? And that actually they did have these time horizons, but they saw it as, yes, there's going to be some environmental degradation, but if, certainly I would say they were not cognizant. They did not, so they didn't emphasize what might be the long-term environmental degradation that in theory could undermine the value of that property. But they very much saw this as a way to secure a long-term time horizon of this property never being developed and staying with the family.
Okay, so we're going to do two questions really fast. I don't think they're right at the heart of your book, but they're interesting questions. One from Hugh Lester, who's from Jersey Shore, Pennsylvania, wants to know just how organized the political right is in the area. He's seen Trump signs get replaced by new judicial candidate signs. He wants to know if a part of the dynamic you're working on is that it's not just the private interests of homeowners, it's also like there's a political movement that's framing the debate. You don't have to say a lot about this, but like to what extent does that distort this conversation?
I mean, I think that that's a great instinct. I mean, I alluded to the fact that the state representatives of this area are, in general, have been and are very supportive of gas drilling, and and so they sort of saw it as their mission to ensure that the opportunities of this industry would would be there. And even, I mean, one of them, State Senator Gene Yall, is very active in pushing back, taking leadership of committees in Harrisburg to ensure that no regulations get put in place that would stymie this industry. Governor Tom Corbett, who was the governor when I was originally lived there, his single biggest campaign contributor was from the oil and gas industry. And it was on his watch that so-called Act 13, the state preemption, was put into place. So definitely the right is politically organized and is in part funded by oil and gas money, and that plays a role here.
Okay, so Leah Diaz wants to know if there's some better way to get natural gas, or is fracking pretty much the standard these days?
There's no better way. I mean, first of all, if you just look at global, we got to keep it in the ground. So, but no, we're doing this because all the easy pockets, so you just drill a vertical hole, hit a pocket, and the gas comes up. They're basically gone or not worth it. And so this is the gas and oil that is still there. And unfortunately, if we don't come to a clean energy standard, under the Marcellus shale are 2 or 3 other layers of shale that we just can't get yet because our technology can't get that deep yet. So no, there's not better gas to get. There's unfortunately worse gas to get.
So we have 2 more questions. The one from Ann Davis, I'm going to take the chair's privilege of answering it myself. She wants to know if the paradox of property is becoming more pervasive as the impacts of the Anthropocene accumulate. I'm voting for yes. Unfortunately, the book is going to become more relevant, as will the key concepts. I'm going to let the last question come from our student, Ankit. I don't know why he's here, because he should be studying for his comps, which he's taking in 2 days. But since he managed to ask a really good question anyway, maybe to get you back for what you're going to do to him this week. So the question Ankit wants to know, and I guess it's really a question, it's a great place to land. It might even give us a hint about where you're going next, is, Colin, is there some kind of common thread or approach to studying environmental problems sociologically that connects your old book on pigeons and this new book on fracking, and that might even determine where you land for your 3rd book?
I would say that probably not. I would say the common thread is more methodological, and maybe this is a way to partly answer Rebecca's question, because I don't just do ethnography because I like hanging out with people or because it tells a good story. I view ethnography as making a distinct contribution to understanding how real people engaged in the world interpret and make sense of their relationships to the environment. And importantly, by tracking the same people across situations and over time, arriving at understandings that I feel I can't get anyway from interviews or survey questions about how their particular beliefs, attitudes, dispositions shape or don't shape what they actually do and what they decide, and the extent to which situations shape the environmental choices and the ways that people relate to the land and the non-human world around them. And so I would say that it's more methodological. And the last thing I'll say, this does relate to Eric's question. I don't have the 3rd book in mind, but I've thought a lot about my dissatisfaction with the ways that we assess environmental decision-making you know, whether through labs or where we give people money and say, would you contribute this money to a collective pool or keep it, or these other kinds of ways, contingent valuation, would you pay $100 to protect a wetland? And so I'm thinking about how ethnography can, you know, start or contribute to new ways of thinking about environmental decision making.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to argue with your interpretation of Gerolmack here, because on my read, you know, what Gerolmack is doing is taking this fairly abstract set of ideas about community and the nature of human connection, and tying them to debates about the roles of animals or non-human actors, and also to the land, in very concrete and tangible ways. And so when Harvey describes the nitty-gritty feel of the book, I think that's not just there for decoration. I think, and that nitty-grittiness is there when we learn about the way people handle pigeons and the way that pigeons, you know, fly and track and are tracked and are able to navigate. It seems to me like what you're doing is introducing into a kind of human-centered sociology, a way of thinking about the way we build collective life and establish some sense of what we value, and you know, how we seek to kind of barter those values in a way that really is novel. And I think there's a lot of, in my view, is that there's a lot of theory about this, and there's a lot of kind of stylish prose, and there's not a lot of really thick description that shows how this works in real life and kind of fleshes out, you know, what it means to live in a world where we're not the only species and where we're dependent on the land. And, you know, my take is that early and late, or should we call it mid Gerolmack, you know, do those things, you know, in really important and novel ways, and that it's a real contribution. So, Colin, you've given us a lot to think with. I'm delighted to know that you don't have a third book, because I think you've earned a little time off. You're not even going to get it though, because your book gets published next week, and everyone gets a chance to hear from you more. I think we'll be reading much more about your book in coming days, and you know, as both Harvey and Rebecca have said, for many more years to come. So thank you for sharing this occasion with us and letting IPK be your host. I know that when your third book does come out, that Harvey will be back to this again. And thanks to all of you who stuck around for this conversation. We went on a little longer than we ordinarily would, but it's worth taking some time to think about what Colin's put on the table for us. Ordinarily at this point, we would retreat into the main room to have a toast and to have you sign books. Colin, will you be sitting on a park bench somewhere signing books in the next few days? Is there a place for
getting crapped on by pigeons?
I hope that you have a chance to connect with Colin, you know, outdoors in real life at some point soon. It's my fantasy that when it's safe enough for all of us to come back together again in person, that, you know, we'll have a kind of giant festival at IPK in which there will be, you know, lots of book signings, you know, lots of authors, and lots of good times. So let's hope we get there very soon. Rebecca, thank you for joining us from London. Harvey, thank you for joining us from California. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Zari and Sam and the IPK staff for putting this together. And Colin, congratulations. We wish you really well.
Thank you. This event was perfect. Seriously. Thank you so much, everyone.